Hello, and welcome to the first ever Line Unbroken card review video. As you know, if you've read the accompanying blog post to these videos, I don't generally do card reviews for the Line Unbroken because basically they've been done to death. But here I'm delving into custom content for the Tales from the Cards First Stage expansion, and since these cards are much less familiar to the player base at large, I figure it's probably a good idea to explain them. Since people are also less familiar with the Silmarillion than with Lord of the Rings, I will also, in some cases, explain who these characters are and what these things are. Since card reviews are better with more than one person, I have my brother David here with me.
Hey.
And for this video, we will be going through the leadership cards from the core First Age set. So, David, why don't you start by reading the first hero?
Okay, Baron is a 8 threat cost hero with 3 willpower, 2 attack, 1 defense, 4 hit points. He has the Edine, House of Baal, and Noble traits, and his text reads, while Baron is committed to the quest, he gains response. After an encounter card with at least 3 threat is revealed from the encounter deck, add 1 resource to Baron's resource pool.
So in the story, Beren and Luthien is probably the best known part of the Silmarillion. The story is Beren was a man, Luthien was an elf, they fell in love, but in order to prove himself worthy to marry her, to her father, Beren had to go to Angband and retrieve one of the 3 Silmarils from Morgoth's crown. The Silmarils, of course, being these legendary gemstones filled with the sort of most perfect heavenly light that had ever existed, and Morgoth being essentially the devil. So it was pretty much seen as an impossible Herculean task, but they did it, and the quests in the First Stage box cover that story as well. So turning to the mechanics, the first comparison that jumps to mind from the official cards is Theodred, who of course simply gives someone a resource when he quests, regardless of what you reveal from the encounter deck. There are, of course, some important differences. While Theodred is more reliable, Beren can trigger more than once in multiplayer. In theory, he could gain 4 resources in a 4-player game, which definitely makes a difference. But on the other hand, he only gains a resource when you reveal a card which has threat equal to his 3 willpower. So, did you have any other thoughts on Beren?
Those were the main ones. It's one thing that is worth pointing out is that most First Age heroes also have a threat discount. In Beren's case, you're getting basically 10 points worth of stats for threat cost of 8, so...
Yes. I asked Ian about this, and he said his standard threat discount was just -1, so the -2 sets Beren apart from most of the heroes.
Another point worth mentioning, if we're drawing the Theodred comparison, of course, is that Beren's willpower is actually his best stat.
Yes, whereas Theodred only has 1 willpower, so it's less worth questing with him, except for his ability. Also, of course, it's relevant knowing the encounter decks and how many cards there are with at least 3 threat that will thus give Beren a resource. One of the particular uses for Beren, other than just gaining additional resources, is, of course, that if you have an event which you want to play during the quest phase, you can spend all your resources, and if you reveal a card with 3 threat, you will still be able to play the event. The only obvious candidate for this is Fresh Tracks, which is on the approved list, which, of course, when an enemy is added to the staging area, you can deal 1 damage to it and stop it making engagement checks that round. So if that enemy has at least 3 threat, or if it is revealed after another card that has at least 3 threat, then you can play that event even if you spend all of your resources. Other than that, I'd say Beren is a fairly simple one. He gives you more resources, that's always good. So let's move on to Finrot Felagund,
who is a 10 threat cost hero with 3 willpower, 3 attack, 1 defense, and 4 hit points. He has the Noldor, House of Finarfin, and Noble traits, and his text reads, while Finrod Felagund is in play, each character with the Edine trait gets +1 willpower.
So Finrod in the story Essentially, the most notable thing about him was that he was friends with everyone, which doesn't sound so impressive until you realise that the First Age was really not a very trusting time. People had lots of enmities and feuds with each other. The different kindreds of elves didn't necessarily trust each other. Elves and men didn't necessarily trust each other. Elves and dwarves definitely didn't really trust each other. But Finrod was friends with all of the different kindreds of elves, all the different houses of the Noldor and everything. He was the first elf to befriend any men, and his second name, Felagund, actually comes from what the dwarves called him. I think it means Lord of Caves, because he also befriended the dwarves. So in this time when no one trusted anyone, everyone trusted Finrod, which is pretty impressive. Mechanically, the obvious comparisons are Dane Ironfoot or Leadership Boromir, and indeed Visionary Leadership, the attachment, in that he grants a global willpower boost, with the difference that he grants it to a trait which he does not himself belong to, which makes for some interesting deck building, wouldn't you say?
Yes, you've essentially covered it. Finrod obviously works very well by pairing him up with, for example, Beren, who we've already mentioned.
Yes, there are 4 Edain heroes in total, Beren and 3 others who we'll get to in the other spheres, and plenty of allies.
Yeah. So you've got that huge willpower strength just by having him on the table, which of course is the other point. Unlike Dane or Boromir, there's no condition for that willpower.
Dane needs to be ready, Boromir needs to have a resource, or Visionary Leadership, you need to have a resource. Finrod just needs to be in play. I would add to that, there is an event which we will be getting to later in this review that allows your Edain to boost your Noldor, so you can recurse the bonus by doing that if you can build it appropriately. In terms of his stats, he's very impressive, obviously. He's Glorfindel minus a hit point. 3 willpower and 3 attack means he obviously benefits from readying effects, and he is, of course, a target for Light of Valinor. His threat discount is the standard -1 compared to his stats, 10 threat versus 11 points of stats. So let's move on to Fingon.
Okay. Fingon is an 11 threat cost hero with 3 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense, and 5 hit points. He has the Noldor, House of Fingolfin, and Noble traits, and his text reads, Action, exhaust Fingon to remove 1 corruption from a character in play, limit once per round.
Yeah, now Fingon's big thing in the story was, well, firstly, he was the next High King of the Noldor after Fingolfin, his father, but also that he reconciled somewhat the House of Feanor to the rest of the Noldor, partly because he was great friends with Feanor's son Maedhros, who was captured and hung by his wrist from the side of Morgoth's fortress of Angband, and Fingon went alone to rescue him, and in the end, with the help of a giant eagle, he got over there. And in fact, he had to cut Maedhros' hand off at the wrist to get him down. But this act of friendship reconciled the two families somewhat where they'd been estranged. Now, turning to the mechanics, I should explain the corruption mechanic. The First Age rulebook reads, Corruption. Corruption is a brand new mechanic in the First Age expansion. It represents the attempts by Morgoth and his servants to sow dissent and evil among the forces of good, as well as the consequences of selfish and treacherous decisions on the part of the heroes. When a character takes corruption from an encounter or player card effect, place a progress token on it. If a character ever has a number of corruption tokens greater than its willpower, it has become corrupted. Note that objective allies are immune to corruption. A corrupted character loses the ally or hero trait and gains the enemy trait, immediately engaging the player that used to control it, and discarding any attachments or resources. The willpower of the corrupted character becomes its threat, while its engagement cost is treated as 0. A corrupted character cannot lose its corrupted status, unless a card specifically allows this. The text box of the corrupted character should be treated as blank. So, Fingon has the ability to remove corruption tokens. This means that he pairs very well with the new Mastery Sphere, which has all of the player card effects that add corruption. He also will help when the quest and encounter cards add corruption to you. How useful he is depends on the amount of corruption you're going to have.
One thing I think that's worth noting in that regard, as kind of indicative, is that Fingon's threat cost does equal his stats.
Yes, so he's one more than the standard -1 for everyone. So clearly Ian reckoned when designing this that being able to remove corruption would be very powerful, and when you see some of the benefits you can get from corruption on player cards, you can kind of see why, as well as the fact that obviously it's a fairly significant challenge that the encounter deck can present you with. His ability requires you to exhaust him, so that's obviously a problem.
Yeah, it's always one of the things I know I consider. Having to exhaust a hero for their ability can feel like one of the heftier costs.
Yes, certainly if they have strong stats, as Fingon does. 3 willpower is something you want to use on any hero, really. 2 defense and 5 hit points. He can defend reasonably well. You may have to heal him afterwards, but still, it's a pretty solid option. So, again, he benefits from Light of Valinor or Unexpected Courage. Potentially, you want to get 3 actions out of him to quest, defend, and use his ability if you're piling up corruption at an accelerated rate. Note, of course, his ability is limit once per round, so you can't just flood your board with corruption and then exhaust him a ton of times to get rid of all of it. Okay, that's all the heroes. Let's move on to the allies. So the first ally we're going to look at is Mablung, not the same Mablung who appears in the official game. Mablung is a 4-cost ally with 2 willpower, 2 attack, 2 defense, 3 hit points. He has the Teleri and Warrior traits, and his text reads, Response. After Mablung commits to a quest, choose a character. That character gets +1 willpower and +1 defense until the end of the round. So the first comparison that springs to mind for me is Arwen.
Yeah, fair comparison.
Yeah. Arwen, of course, triggers when she exhausts, whereas Mablung it is specifically when he commits to the quest, and Arwen grants the Sentinel keyword, but does not grant +1 willpower, which is interesting. It obviously gives Mablung some flexibility, especially if you target a character who has a readying effect on them, such as, say we were just talking about Fingon, you potentially want him to quest and defend and use his ability, so he could then benefit from having +1 willpower and +1 defense in the same round. There are some other possibilities among the characters in the first stage box and indeed on the approved list. The first which came to my mind was Ally Treebeard. Since, of course, he has 2 willpower, you potentially want to quest with him. He has 3 defense and 5 hit points. He's a very good defender, and he has an ability which allows him to ready himself when you want him to. So that can be very handy. The other thing which I thought about Mablung is that he has very versatile stats, 2s across the board, 3 hit points. You can use him for anything, but his ability only triggers when he quests. So you're potentially wasting some of those stats. You're often going to be paying for 2 willpower and the ability and nothing else.
Well, I think the one small thing you could add to that is that if you do have any means of readying your allies, it does also make him a very good target for that,
yes,
which
obviously
somewhat compensates. Equally, if you're going to pay the 4 resources for him, it's potentially still worth it just for the 2 willpower and the ability, plus hit points, which can be used for direct damage.
Yes.
That's never wasted.
Yep, and of course he is a leadership ally, so 4 resources is not necessarily as expensive as it might be in other spheres when you have resource generation like Berra and another card that we'll be getting to later. So he's a pretty good choice.
Okay, next one we've got is Arodreth, who is a 4-cost ally with 2 willpower, 3 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points. He has the Noldor, House of Finarfin, and Noble traits, and his text reads, Response. After a unique character with the House of Finarfin trait leaves play, put Arodreth into play from your hand.
So this is thematic, because Arodreth was essentially the guy who Finrot left in charge if he wasn't there, and when he left and when he died. It's also a case, I would say, where it seems like Ian looked at something in the official content which didn't really work, specifically Brock Iron Fist, and decided to make it work. Where, of course, Brock, you need to have a dwarf hero leave play. Here, it's just a unique character with the House of Finarfin trait that needs to leave play, so you can trigger it from allies as well, which is a much less of a big cost to bring in your powerful ally. Also, the cost of 4 compared to the cost of 6 means you might actually pay for him on occasion, possibly. I don't think we ever have.
No, I don't think we have.
But it's possible.
Yes, it's, as I say, it is also very thematic, and of course can be used when, say, Finrot leaves play, which would be the thematic version. You've still lost a hero, which, unless you were planning for that, isn't necessarily what you wanted, but still. As for Rodreth himself, though obviously any other character with the House of Finarfin trait works, one of the most obvious ones is essentially Rodreth himself.
Yes. If you have 2 copies of him, one of him is in play and dies to an attack or some direct damage, you can put another into play straight away. Or you can play Sneak Attack. Sneak Attack Rodreth into play. At the end of the phase, he will leave play, and then after he leaves play, since he is a unique character with the House of Finarfin trait who has just left play, you can put him back into play from your hand. So you've effectively paid 1 resource to get in a 4-cost ally for the rest of the game, and in that first round he gets 2 actions.
I think I'd also highlight at this point there is one other specific ally who works well with Rodreth.
Yes, we'll get her in the Spirit cards review. The next ally is the Chieftain of Men. The Chieftain of Men is a 2-cost ally with 1 willpower, 2 attack, 0 defense, 2 hit points, the Edine trait, and the text response. After your threat is raised by an encounter card effect, discard Chieftain of Men from play to cancel that effect. My first thought is, I'm going to be kind of reluctant to trigger that ability. Most threat raises aren't that big that you want to chuck an ally just to stop them, wouldn't you say?
Yes. I know I've found cards that can cancel a threat raise. You tend to sort of keep looking at them going, well, come on, where's there something that's really worth using this for?
If you're worried about your threat, you're more likely to bring threat reduction cards from the Spirit Sphere rather than discarding your allies. On the other hand, I mean, the Edine, as we will start to see, can go for kind of a swarm strategy, which particularly goes well with Finrod's global willpower boost, so maybe you have allies to spare and can afford to just get rid of one. That was my next point. He pairs obviously very well with Finrod, and I'm going to be saying this for many, many allies, because they all have the Edine trait. So with Finrod in play, he's effectively 2 willpower and 2 attack, and 2 hit points, which is a fairly solid stat line for only 2 resources.
Even the 2 attack for 2 resources outside of tactics is
that's
always a good thing.
Beyond that, if you don't use his ability, he's just very generic and useful.
It's also worth noting, of course, that he is non-unique.
Yes, so you can have 3 of these guys.
As we'll see, there aren't actually that many non-unique allies.
Yes, there are so many significant first-stage characters that most of the allies are the unique ones. So the next card.
Okay, yes, the next ally then is Hador, who is a 3-cost ally with 1 willpower, 2 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points, the Edine and House of Hador traits, and the text action. Discard Hador to reveal the top 5 cards of your deck. Put up to 2 revealed allies with the Edine trait into play if able. Shuffle all other revealed cards back into your deck.
So there is one very obvious comparison card in the official content, which is also on the approved list. A very good tail.
It's obviously a very different kind of cost because...
Yeah, you discard an ally rather than exhausting one. You also, after doing it, rather than discarding all of those 5 cards, you shuffle the ones that don't come into play back into your deck, which can be seen as good or bad, depending on how you want to play it. Sometimes you don't want to use a very good tail because you're afraid of discarding good cards that you have in your deck that are events or attachments. But on the other hand, at other times, if you're just running a really ally-heavy deck, you're kind of pretty happy to discard everything that's not an ally.
I think the other point you could say is even in an ally heavy deck, though, with very good tails, there's always the risk of discarding an additional ally
there is that.
to it. Whereas here, pulling the allies, with Hador, also I'd say is a worthwhile point that you can consider running 3 copies. And usually for unique allies, I know I tend to often only put in 2 copies.
Yeah, unless they're really crucial to your strategy, you don't want to have dead cards in your hand. But with Hador, when you draw another copy, you can discard the first one and play the new one. Or sometimes you maybe discard one and there's another copy in the top 5 cards of your deck who just comes straight into play. And then you can use his stats for a while before discarding him, or just discard him straight away to get even more allies.
Another point as well is that since it doesn't require him to exhaust to use his ability, you can make use of his stat line in a given round and then discard him in the hopes of pulling in some more allies. So
exactly, especially, again, he pairs well with Finrot. So with Finrot in play, he could quest for 2, and then you discard him to bring in some more allies who can help you with combat. The next ally is Berra here, who incidentally is Baron's father. Berra here is a 3-cost ally with 1 willpower, 1 attack, 3 defense, 3 hit points, the Edine and House of Beor traits. He is a sentinel, and he has response. After a shadow card is revealed, exhaust Berra here to add his defense to the defense of the defending character until the end of the phase. Again, there is a very obvious comparison in the modern card pool, which is Hero Dory. And indeed, one of the big criticisms of Hero Dory is that you have to trigger him when the hero is declared as a defender, not after the shadow card is revealed. So Berra here neatly gets around that. It does mean that if you somehow discard the shadow card, you can't trigger him, but then you know exactly how much damage you're taking, so it's probably not an issue. And equally, like Hero Dory, if you don't need him to boost someone else's defense, he is a sentinel and can just defend for himself. It's hard to say anything bad about Berra here, to be honest.
Yeah, I think you've basically covered all the good points, and yes, he's still relatively straightforward, and as far as kind of stats for cost, he is, 3 resources for 3 defense and 3 hit points would be good. Adding in kind of a point of willpower and attack as well, the off chance you need them.
It's highly unlikely that you will ever use those stats, but you can if you want. I suppose I will mention at this point, of course, it's always good to keep an eye on willpower stats because of the existence of the corruption mechanic. So anything with 0 willpower is a potential liability if the encounter deck may add corruption. But 1, you're probably safe, and more, it's not such an issue. So that takes us through all of the allies. We move on to attachments, with one which may seem very familiar.
This is High Kingship of the Noldor, which is a 2-cost attachment. It's unique. It's got the title trait, and the text reads, attached to a Noldor hero, and action, exhaust High Kingship of the Noldor to add 2 resources to attached hero's resource pool.
Yeah. So, in a lot of my notes here that I've got, I have a note to compare to a card. Here it doesn't say compare, it just says Steward of Gondor, because this is Steward of Gondor in the first stage. There are a few cards like this where you can see that's literally he's just taken a card and transported it. It's not something that didn't work in the official content, it's something that worked so well that he doesn't want the first stage players to be without it. There are, of course, some notable differences.
But the only one in this case is that instead of granting a trait, High Kingship requires it. So...
Yes, I suppose it's one notable difference, but it is very notable. We should note at this point that, of course, we've seen 2 Noldor heroes so far, Finrod Felgund and Fingon. There are 5 more in the first stage material, and a few on the approved list if you want to use those. So there are a decent number of options for where you want to put this. Do they cover all spheres? No, there's no Noldor hero in spirit in the first stage.
Not without going to the approved list,
Yes,
no.
in the approved list you can use Glorfindel.
Or Galadriel.
Yes, but other than that, all of the spheres are covered, so if you want more resources anywhere, High Kingship can give you them. There is also, there is a first stage attachment, which we'll get to in the Spirit Review, which can give you the Noldor trait, or of course, there is a neutral attachment in the official game, which gives you the Noldor trait, though of course it was released considerably after the first stage box, so that was not known at the time. So the next attachment is the Harp of Fingon. It is unique. It is a 2-cost attachment with the Instrument trait, and it reads, attached to a hero with the House of Fingolfin trait. Action. After a corruption token... there's a slight errata to this. It should be response. After a corruption token is removed from play, exhaust Harp of Fingon to add 1 resource to the attached hero's resource pool. So, obviously, it's not High Kingship, or indeed Steward, but 2 cost for 1 resource. Well, it could potentially be 1 resource per round, which would still be reasonable. It could be less, but you still may consider that worthwhile. Of course, there is only one way to remove corruption at this point, which is Fingon.
Who, of course, the harp, not surprisingly, synergizes perfectly with.
Yes, but you don't have to put it on him. You don't have to put it on him even though he's the one removing the corruption. It's as soon as a corruption is removed from anywhere, you can trigger this. And so, yes, Fingon, of course, has the House of Fingolfin trait. There are 3 other heroes with that trait who are thus targets for the Harp of Fingon. So now onto the Oath of Friendship.
Yes. This is a 1-cost attachment with the Oath trait, and the text reads, attached to a hero, limit 2 in play. Action, move any number of resources from the attached hero's resource pool to the resource pool of another hero with Oath of Friendship attached. And response, after you play Oath of Friendship, you may immediately search your deck for another copy of Oath of Friendship and add it to your hand. Then shuffle your deck.
So the second part of this, the response, immediately brings to mind keeping count, where one of the biggest problems is you play 1 copy of keeping count, and then it builds up a load of resources, so as soon as you get that second copy and attach it, you'll have a massive attack boost, and then you never draw it. Whereas this circumvents that by instantly digging out another copy from your deck.
One of the things I think with the Oath of Friendship is that obviously one of the downsides of some of the more obvious forms of resource generation, so Steward of Gondor, the one everybody's used to, or High Kingship for this, yes, is that ends up stacking a lot of resources on one hero, and sometimes what you need is them spread around a bit more, which of course is exactly what Oath of Friendship allows you to do. It may only allow you to transfer them essentially between 2 specific heroes, but presumably one of them is the one who has High Kingship.
And that at least spreads your resources across 2 different spheres, if nothing else. You can compare it, obviously, to effects like Errand Rider, the new leadership Denethor, Hero Biffa, or Parting Gifts. And obviously, it's pretty comparable to Denethor or Biffa, I would say. It's less flexible than Errand Rider and Parting Gifts, but compared to Errand Rider, you just play the 2 copies of these and then you can do it as much as you want without having to exhaust an ally. Compared to Parting Gifts, it's an attachment rather than an event, so there's definitely a comparison. And of course, compared to Parting Gifts, you can do it in both directions, and neither of them potentially has to be a leadership hero.
I think the one other note I've got is that it is, of course, better in multiplayer.
Yes, obviously. Solo, you may well be able to manage without this, though still you can consider it if you have 2 or 3 spheres in your deck and want to smooth out the resources between them while using High Kingship. And obviously the other point is that it pairs well with any resource generation such as Berra, High Kingship, or the Harp of Fingon. So the next attachment is the Ring of Barahir. This is, I believe, the same Ring of Barahir that appears in the official content, but by the time of the Third Age it's only an heirloom, whereas this is its original purpose, where it was a symbol of friendship between Finrot Felagund and Barahir. So you'll see the effect is very thematic. It is a unique 2-cost attachment with the item and artifact traits. It reads, attached to an Edyne hero. Action, discard Ring of Barahir to put a unique Noldor ally into play from your hand. So, as I said, it's very thematic because that is basically what the Ring of Barahir was for. It was a promise to give aid if it was asked for. So this is one of a few effects in the first stage that I would say are kind of multi-sphere effects. They're not explicitly multi-sphere like some of the cards we're getting in the Dream Chaser cycle now, but they clearly work better if you play them in a multi-sphere context, because in this case, unique Noldor allies, there aren't that many in leadership. There is a Rodreth, and then if you go to the approved list, you can also have ally Eristor and ally Galadriel, but there's the question of whether you want those or whether you'd prefer to stick just to the first stage cards. Whereas if you look at other spheres, well, in the first stage itself, leaving aside the approved list, there are 9 unique Noldor allies. 6 of them appear in the Mastery sphere. So the Ring of Barahir is excellent in a Leadership Mastery combination deck.
Or indeed, of course, in multiplayer by playing it across table.
Yes. Play it from the Leadership deck to the Mastery deck. And exactly. Also, I think all the unique Noldor in Mastery are expensive as well. Whereas, say, the one in Spirit costs 1 resource, so you don't really want to spend 2 resources on an attachment to play her for free. So the next card, we're moving on to the events.
Yes. Strength of Men is a 3-cost event with the text Action. Exhaust an ally with the Edyne trait. Add the willpower, attack, and defense of that ally to all characters with the Noldor trait you control until the end of the round.
This is the card I obliquely referred to when talking about Finrot that allows you to sort of recurse the bonus from Finrot to the Edyne and back to Finrot and the Noldor again. The obvious comparison is the Tale of Tenuviel event from the Dread Realm, with some obvious differences. It costs more. You don't get a readying effect out of it, but it applies to multiple characters, not just one, with the boost. And it's adding willpower, attack, and defense to willpower, attack, and defense rather than just adding willpower to everything, which obviously gets you different stuff. It combos very well with Finrod because it doesn't say printed willpower, attack, and defense, so whichever Edyne ally you use this with will have +1 willpower from Finrod, which will then be added back. The definite restriction is that it targets characters with Noldor traits that you control. So you can't have an Edyne deck that then plays Strength of Men to boost all the Noldor on the table. You need to have Edyne and Noldor in your own deck.
To some extent, it comes back to being somewhat multi-sphere, though it's still potentially worth it just to boost either Finrod or Fingon. So
yeah, potentially. But yes, because there are a lot of Edyne allies in leadership, but not so many Noldor, so you potentially want to go into another sphere to get all the Noldor to be boosted by this. And then it can be difficult to fit everything into your deck, unless maybe if this is your specific focus, the thing that you're specifically trying to do.
One thing I'd mention, this is one of those cards, I don't think I've ever actually used this. Some of it, I think, because it's that awkward 3-cost.
Yeah, where it's too expensive to be cheap, but too cheap to be a massive, big effect that you save up for.
Exactly. I always find events in particular, of course.
Yeah, it's a card which I have often wanted to put in a deck and then cut for space. When I was thinking about it, I did come up with some additional points that, of course, it adds to all stats, but sometimes you don't necessarily need all stats. So maybe you could just use it for a willpower boost. Even if you have not that many Edyne allies, if you just have like 3 copies of Chieftain of Men in your deck, get one of them into play with Finrod, and then you have a bunch of Noldor, so you exhaust them to add 2 willpower to all of your Noldor who are questing. Then that's actually a pretty significant boost to your questing, and you also get +2 attack to all of them if you care, which you don't necessarily. Otherwise, obviously, there's also Hador as a possibility for more of a spread of stats. Barahir if you really want some more defense. Though, of course, he can also do that with his own ability, and it's less likely that you need a global defense buff. So the next event is Hour of Need. It is a 2-cost event, which reads Response. If at least X enemies are engaged with players, X being equal to twice the number of players, each player may put one ally into play from his hand, if able. So, this is a card which sounds really good, but it also sounds difficult to use, which is why I think I've never played it.
I don't think I have either. So
there's some serious risk-reward going on here, because, well, if you're playing solo, you need to have at least 2 enemies. That could maybe happen. That's more controllable to have 2 enemies. But to get up to in 2-player, you need 4 enemies. If you're playing 4-player, you need to have 8 enemies. I suppose getting up to 4-player, there's more chance that things will just get out of control, so you end up with that where you weren't expecting to, which may be one of the reasons that I haven't played it, because I'm more likely to play 2-player or 2-handed. It's very good if you can do it, but other times it'll just be a case of, well, we keep killing all the enemies, so we never are able to trigger this, and it's just a dead card in your hand. Obviously, it's specifically likely to be good in any quest which is just an enemy swarm, because that sort of quest obviously is designed to have you engaged with high numbers of enemies. And otherwise, we know from the Dunedain mechanics in the Angmar Awakened cycle that there are ways and means by which you can keep a number of engaged enemies. So if you want specifically to trigger Hour of Need, and certainly it could be worth it, because there are some expensive allies that you could get into play by using it, maybe you deliberately take on enemies and don't kill them, so long as you have means of surviving having them engaged with you.
Okay, next one is Hold to the Oath, which is a 1-cost event with the Oath trait that reads Action. Each character with an attached oath gets +1 willpower, +1 attack, and +1 defense until the end of the round.
This is another one that I think is potentially difficult to use, and I'm not sure if I ever have used it. But again, it's one which I keep putting into decks and then taking out for space. The obvious comparisons I came up with are Durin's Song and Halfling Determination, which of course choose just a single hero who gets +2 to all their stats, whereas this does multiple characters and only +1.
Really, I mean, the note I made is that essentially it is rather dependent on the number of oaths in play, how useful it is. Which, in turn, of course, is somewhat dependent on the quality of any oath cards that you may have. Now,
yes, the Oath of Friendship is very good, but you can only have a maximum of 2 in play, even though you can have 3 in your deck. There are 3 more Oath cards, which we will get to in the other reviews, and they're more mixed, I would say. I do like the theoretical idea of being able to build an Oath deck, where you just put oaths on everyone and then play Hold to the Oath. Although, yeah, of course, Hold to the Oath, it wouldn't stack the boosts if you attach multiple oaths to the same hero, which is a shame, because you might want to stack your oaths on the same hero.
On the other hand, again, in multiplayer it might be possible, but it's...
Yeah, it would be more a multiplayer thing. I mean, some of the oaths can attach to characters as well as heroes, but not all of them. So ideally, you probably want more heroes around the table so you can get oaths on everyone. So, Manway's Pity is a 0-cost event with the Valor trait, and it reads Response. After a unique Noldor ally you control is destroyed by an enemy attack, immediately put into play another copy of that ally from your hand. So the first thing is, of course, this is another kind of multi-sphere card, because the only first stage leadership Noldor is, again, a Rodrath, and he has that effect built in. And, again, as with the Ring of Barahir, we are most likely to look at the Mastery Sphere, because that has 6 unique Noldor allies that you could potentially trigger this on. It also, since Mastery has all the corruption effects, potentially gives you a reason why you might want to kill one of them off and replace them. If you stack a bunch of corruption on one of your unique Noldor allies, and then kill them off before they turn into an enemy and bring in a fresh new version.
Next card then is Secret Toil, a one-cost event with the text, Action, exhaust 2 heroes you control to reveal the top 5 cards of your deck. Choose 1 attachment or ally and put it into play for no cost. Shuffle all other revealed cards back into your deck.
So, my immediate thought for comparison to this was Peace and Thought, with the obvious difference that Peace and Thought is a refresh action, so exhausting those 2 heroes means that they will not be ready for the subsequent round, whereas this is merely an action, so it can just be a case of, if you have 2 heroes still ready at the end of combat, then you can just exhaust them for this effect, which can be a very powerful effect. The issue is, do you really want to plan for that? And that's why I've never actually used this card as much as I want to.
Yeah, again, I don't think I have either. It is that sense as well of it being very costly in actions, and I would say that might actually be a bit more problematic in the first stage, where really you've got a lot of very strong stat lines on your heroes, so...
You don't want to waste them.
Exactly.
Yeah, so obviously if you have readying effects, if you have multiple copies of Unexpected Courage in play, then you can potentially use those. It works in a similar way to Peace and Thought, I suppose. If you're playing kind of a turtling strategy where you go very slowly, then you may be able to set up a situation where you'll be able to use this, but it's difficult in just a random deck. And the final leadership card is Flame Light Flee Knight. It is a 1-cost event which reads, play only if you control a hero with the Edine trait. Action. Search your deck for a character with the Edine trait and put it into play. That character does not exhaust to quest, attack, or defend until the end of the round. Discard that character at the end of the round. So this is kind of like Sneak Attack, or Tomio My Kinsfolk, or the Ranger of Cardolan, in that it gives you a temporary ally who then, in this case, is discarded at the end of the round, rather than just a phase, which makes it more like the Ranger of Cardolan. But this is an incredibly powerful effect, even if you just use it on the very generic Chieftain of Men. You quest for 1 or 2 if Finrot is in play, and could then... Potentially he could defend without exhausting if it's a very weak enemy, otherwise he'll probably die. Or then he can attack everything engaged with you for 2 without exhausting. There are 2 allies who I feel this combos particularly well with, however, for the 2 different aspects. Since the character is discarded at the end of the round, you can choose Hador. Since, of course, Hador's ability requires you to discard him, you just have him quest for 1 or 2 with Finrod. Possibly defend if he'll survive, but probably not. Attack everything for 2, and then you discard him to bring in some more allies who will be permanent allies, and he was going to be discarded anyway. The other good option is playing with the not exhausting aspect, and that is Berra here, who then, of course, I said earlier, you're probably never going to use his willpower and attack, but in this case, you could use them, and so he can quest for 1 without exhausting, or 2 with Finrod, and then you could use his attack after he defends everything, because he's a sentinel, for 3. Alternatively, an interesting point, he can be declared as a defender without exhausting him, and then you could trigger his ability after the shadow card is revealed to add his defense to his defense, which is a bit weird, but it works. And then you have to discard him at the end of the round, but he's just covered like all your combat needs for that round. So yeah, again, an incredibly powerful card. This is one that I have used quite a bit, and it's hard to justify not using it if you can, I would say. Did you have anything more on that?
I think you covered it. You mentioned essentially the 2 really effective combos, which...
Yep. Obviously there are more Edine allies in other spheres, but still I think Hador and Berra here are the best options.
Yes. The only thing we haven't touched on is, of course, the restriction that you have to have an Edine hero to play it, but that is not particularly difficult. Among other things, the one we've covered so far, Baron, is pretty strong leadership hero with the Edine traits, so
Yeah.
he sphere matches the cards, he allows you to play it, so yeah.
Yeah. Alright, so that's all the leadership cards from the first stage set. Next we'll be moving on to the spirit cards. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.
And goodbye.